The southernmost part of what is now Illinois was given a name inspired by the Nile River and Egypt. It would be named Cairo. The Mississippi and Ohio River gave the settlement amazing potential, so it would be developed as a river port that would compete with Chicago for the biggest city in the state. This town has had its place in history and pop culture from the 1800s. Author Charles Dickens had heard about this mine of golden hope all the way from England, but was repulsed with his visit. So much that in his full-length novel after his return to England, Cairo reappeared as Eden, a set of broken-down log cabins in a swamp between two rivers. The American author Mark Twain visited 40 years later, encountered with a more positive description of a brisk town that was substantially built and had a city look to it. Twain would also use Cairo as one of the primary destinations in the book Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where Jim hoped to escape to freedom by taking a steamboat up to the state of Ohio. This may have all been inspired by the fact that Cairo was a transfer station on the Underground Railroad. And another interesting tidbit was that General Grant had a command station there during the Civil War. The town's first brush with misfortune occurred in the late 1800s when a railroad bridge was built, which hurt the market for river trade. This would be followed by major issues with race relations. Specifically in 1909, William James, a black man, was accused of murdering a white woman. A vicious mob began developing. The local sheriff tried escorting William James out of town to receive a more fair trial, but the growing mob stopped them in Karnak, Illinois, about 30 miles north. These riders brought James back to Cairo and attempted to hang him from the steel beam archway over 8th Street and Commercial Avenue. The rope snapped and he fell. When he stood up, he was shot over 500 times. And fair warning, if gruesome things disturb you, fast forward about 15 seconds. According to the documentary Between Two Rivers, his body was dragged through town, his head was cut off and put on a stake, his heart cut out, chopped up and sold as souvenirs, and his body was burned and spit on by men, women, and children. It was an unimaginable act of violence and one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard. The barbaric, bloodthirsty mob hadn't had enough, so they broke into the local jail, took out a white man by the name of Henry Salzner, who had murdered his wife, and hanged and shot him. The Illinois militia was forced to come in and end the violence in Cairo. Cairo's low elevation has always been vulnerable to flooding. Therefore, the city is surrounded by levees and flood walls, literally to the point that if southern Illinois flooded enough, Cairo would become an island. The town has had a number of impactful floods, but one of the worst was in 2011 when locals had to be evacuated. During the 1960s, we see a town that is very segregated. Power, wealth, and influence heavily favored white people. In 1967, a 19-year-old black American soldier was arrested and found hanged in his cell. The police reported it as a suicide. This story was not well accepted by the black community due to the history of the town and the history of police brutality towards people of color. The rioters demanded the truth, equality, and a stop of police brutality. A large segment of the white population of the town in response created the White Hats, which clashed with protesters. A year and a half later, Cairo civil rights activists came together to form the Cairo United Front. The group demanded a black police chief, assistant fire chief, and an equal black-to-white ratio in city government. After more and more fighting, the National Guard was deployed in an attempt to bring peace to Cairo. The United Front began boycotting white businesses, which forced people to move out and hurt the local economy. At this point, the population really took a nosedive. In 1978, the Interstate 57 bridge opened and even more people left on top of that. In 1987, its hospital closed, which stands to this day and has been explored by many YouTubers. In 2001, the foam factory shut its doors, and as previously mentioned, the 2011 flood forced an evacuation of the town. In 2017, a paper mill temporarily closed, but even that pushed more people out. Today, there are now less than 2,000 people who live there and many abandoned buildings. There hasn't been a new private home built in over 50 years, and the high school serves as a spot for most town meetings and functions. While it may not sound like much, in 2023, the town opened a grocery store for the first time in 7 years. Despite its turbulent history, there are good people there that still call this place home, white and black. It's a step forward and a long journey ahead to make it better. History should never be erased. It should always be told and learned from. So in conclusion, in 1836, Cairo was established. In 1842, world-renowned author Charles Dickens visits and uses it as inspiration in the book Martin Chuzzlewit for the town Eden in a non-flattering way. During the Civil War, General Grant uses a command center in Cairo. The most famous author in the United States, Mark Twain, visits in 1882 and uses the town in his book Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The railroad bridge would be constructed in 1889 and would hamper the booming river trade in Cairo. In 1903, the tunnel that we currently drive through was built, and 11 years later, the floodgate was also. In 1909, the terrible lynching of William James occurred and would leave a nasty scar in the town's history. Nearly 60 years later, we see the tensions in race relations peak with the death of soldier Robert Hunt. In 1978, the I-57 bridge is constructed and the population drops even more. The hospital closes its doors in 1987, the foam factory closes in 2001, even more people move away. An evacuation is forced due to flooding in 2011. And finally, in 2023, Cairo opens its first grocery store in 7 years. From the days of competing with Chicago and Mark Twain, the big river trade, to the ugly race relations and the shell of what it is today, this has been before and after.